Okay, good morning, everybody. We're just waiting for people to join us. And while we do that, if I could just ask all our panelists to turn off their microphones for now, and then to turn them on again when they need you.
I don't actually know how to do it on a laptop, so I'll have to leave mine and be quiet. Sorry.
So I think we're up to 29 people. Let's just wait a minute or two longer, see if anyone else is going to join us. See if we can get to 30. Yeah, we're up to 30 people. That's it. Oh, and somebody's just gone. It's always disconcerting to look at the numbers when people have taken a look at you and decided they don't like it. Okay, good morning, everybody. My name's Alison Inman. I'm a past president of the Chartered Institute of Housing, and I spent my year as president looking at domestic abuse and housing, and what the housing sector could do to try and play its part in dealing with what is undoubtedly an epidemic, and an epidemic that's got more severe during lockdown. As a result of that work, obviously you can't talk about domestic abuse, women, housing without talking about homelessness. And it's absolutely fantastic that the Centre for Homelessness Impact have put on this 5-week-long festival and invited the panel here today to talk about women's homelessness in the and responses during COVID. And the theme for this week is creating a housing system that leaves no one behind. And I think that's particularly apt when we're talking about women and homelessness. I'm not going to rehearse all the figures because they're all out there. People know them, but I think it's just really important to say before we start today that all the research, whether it's academic research, whether it's talking to people with lived experience, whether it's service users, everything we know shows that women's experience of homelessness is different to that of men. And it's really important that we note that, and when we centre the experiences of women when we're looking to deal with homelessness. And another point, we will be talking, no doubt, at some point about rough sleeping, but that's not the main focus of what we're talking about today. Homelessness, as everybody knows, is much broader than just people who are sleeping on the streets, although anyone who's a practitioner will know that the most dangerous place for a woman to be homeless is on the streets, and that's the reason why women take other decisions that will keep them off the street. So we hope our panel, well, we know our panelists is going to be brilliant, tell us some really interesting stuff. But we've got a comment box and we've got a Q&A box. So please use that function just to say, join in, say hello, and use the Q&A function if you've got any questions for me to put to the panel later on. The hashtag for the festival is CHI Fest 2020. Please get involved on Twitter, on Instagram, and I think other social media platforms are available. So before we start, I'm going to introduce our panel really quickly. Find the bits of paper. We've got Kelly Henderson, who is a founding member of DAHA, the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, and she's going to talk about her work and the work of DAHA engaging the social housing sector and the wider sector to deal with domestic abuse. We've got Lucy Baldwin. Lucy is a senior lecturer and researcher at De Montfort University. Well, she's worked in the criminal and social justice centre systems for over 30 years. And she's the author and editor of Mothering Justice, working with mothers in criminal and social justice settings, which is the first UK book to take motherhood and criminal justice as a focus. And while we're on that, just to alert people to some work being done by Cash on motherhood and homelessness. Really interesting piece of work. I definitely advise you to go and have a look at that. And we've got Amanda Hales, who's part of a group who is not 12 women, obviously, she's one woman, a brilliant one, a group of 12 women who came together to share their experiences, all been involved in street prostitution in Hull, and their book, An Untold Story, tells the story of their lives through poetry, interviews, prose and artwork. And there was a fantastic feature, I think, in The Guardian recently about them, so do look them up. Amanda's a peer researcher for Ava and Agenda and works towards change for other women experiencing multiple disadvantage. We've just had a little chat about hating the term multiple disadvantage, but at the moment we can't think of a better one, so we're going to have to run with that. Walters is a resettlement officer with Essex Community Rehabilitation Company and holds the Women's Service Users cohort. Got 20 years experience working in probation and both in court, in the community and with people in prison. Elise is also the branch secretary of Unison, Eastern Region Probation Branch, and I'm sure we'll highlight the fact that whatever other ancillary part of the world you work in, housing is at the centre of solving so many of the social problems facing people today. So without further ado, I've got the really difficult job of asking our panel to speak for 5 minutes each. Not quite sure how that's going to go, so I might have to start waving at you. But Kelly, I think you're going to kick us off.
Yeah, hello everybody. 5 minutes is no mean task for me. So just to introduce myself, I'm Kelly Henderson and I'm one of the co-founders of the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance. And really, DAHA. So really what DAHA is all about is about improving the housing sector response to domestic abuse, so that housing providers are able to best recognise and respond to domestic abuse. And you might be thinking, well, what's that got to do with homelessness? Well, obviously, if we can best recognise and respond to domestic abuse, that quite often means that we can get in early as housing providers and do something to stop that person becoming homeless as a result of domestic abuse. DAHA have got 3 main areas of work. So one of our main tasks is really lobbying the government and the housing sector to think about domestic abuse. And one of the things that we talk about quite a lot is about the housing sector being regulated to recognise and respond to domestic abuse, because at the minute there's no clear regulation which sets out that we need to do that. So we feel strongly that that needs to happen. Also, we carry out research and disseminate good practice around domestic abuse and housing, including homelessness. And as part of what we do at DAHA, we've got a fantastic colleague at Standing Together, who's one of the co-founders of DAHA, Louisa Steele, who I'm sure that many people in the homeless sector will know all about Louisa's work around women and homelessness. So we've kind of got that work going on as well. And we offer an accreditation service for social landlords to really measure their impact and if is their response good and how they can improve that. So that's DAHA in a nutshell. And I would say that one of the things that we're looking at really is why do women always have to move out of the home? So I think one of the key areas that I was hoping to talk about today, and I hope it comes up in questions, is I think the housing sector needs to get much better at responding to perpetrators and giving women more choices, so that if they don't want to go in a refuge, that they can stay in the home when it's safe to do so, and that we can get men out of the properties. I'm saying that because I come from domestic abuse refuge background, so I'm specifically talking about women as victims and men as perpetrators. So I would say that we need to think much more creatively in the housing sector to stop women having to go into refuges when they'd rather stay in their home, and then do something more about the actual cause of the domestic abuse, the perpetrators. So I think that's one of the areas that I've been working on, and I was seconded to Northumbria Police for the last year. I've just been back since April, and one of the things I was working on there was looking at how we respond to perpetrators and looking at the housing element of how housing engages with that. So when lockdown happened, I was tasked with working with all of the Tyne-and-Wear local authority areas to see if we could include perpetrators of domestic abuse who was served a domestic violence protection notice, if we could get them classed as rough sleepers per se and get them housed. It was a really positive piece of work with the Tyne-and-Wear local authorities, where they did recognise that they would see perpetrators served with a domestic violence protection notice as rough sleepers, and they were housed, meaning that we could then get in there with the victim within 48 hours and provide support, so that they didn't feel like they had to leave their home due to fear. So that was kind of one piece of work that I've been involved in, and being able to take that kind of learning back to Daha. I'm about to hit 5 minutes, so am I okay? Oh my goodness, that's a first. I was trying to be good. So I think one of the things as well, in terms of COVID, that Daha is really passionate about, is I think that when we're looking at what's going to happen post-COVID, and when we're looking at people who've been housed in hotels, etc., we see that the domestic abuse commissioner needs to be involved in any conversations that government are having in terms of moving women on out of refuges, out of hotels, etc. So I think that's one of the key things that we are really passionate about, is making sure that the domestic abuse commissioner is involved in the key discussions that will impact on women who are leaving hotel accommodation or refuge, so that they do have safe, secure accommodation to go to, so therefore they don't become homeless again. And that it's a really considered approach, and it's not just looking at it from one angle, saying okay, you've been housed as a rough sleeper, so we're now just going to leave you to it, and then that person is just going to become homeless again. So we argue in Daha that the domestic abuse commissioner must be involved in any discussions that the government are having as part of the rough sleeping task force, to ensure that women don't become homeless again, don't return to perpetrators, or don't end up rough sleeping again. Okay, that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Kelly. Lots to think about there. So next we're going to go to Lucy, who's sitting in the back garden, I think.
No, I'm in the conservatory. Morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. I am by no means an expert in homelessness, but it's a massive part of the work I do with mothers in and after prison. And as Alison said at the beginning, I am an ex-social worker and probation officer, so housing and domestic abuse has been part of my work and life, sadly, for a very long time. So I'm going to talk specifically about women in and after prison and homelessness and domestic abuse, but particularly mothers. And homelessness for women to prison is since 2015. Almost half of the women who went to prison is in a registered or fixed aboard, which is a huge amount. It's almost 4,000 women a year who go through the prison system and are no fixed aboard. And sadly, because of some of the challenges with through care and the lack of availability of support and housing, most of those women will come back out of prison homeless as well. So 2 in 5 women are leaving prison homeless. And like we said at the beginning, we know about multiple disadvantage and women having complex needs. So many of those women will be traumatized women who have experienced domestic abuse, and therefore some of their living options that might have been there in the past are no longer there. And you know, some of the reasons why women go to prison in the first place can be traced directly back to domestic abuse, and that's really sad. You know, it's kind of a combination of poverty and domestic abuse are probably two of the main drivers. And you know, if you've got a domestic abuser who then controls the finances and who controls the support, then you can see how women can end up in situations. We've got women who go to prison for debt because they don't have the means to pay anything off because they're being controlled. And similarly, women don't, all particularly mothers, they don't always ask or seek support because the biggest fear for them is losing their children. And there's always this observant eye of, well, you know, is the mother failing to protect? And I think we need to ask a much bigger question. It's not about the mother's failure to protect her children, it's about society's failure to protect the mothers. And I think we have to do so much more on a bigger scale structurally to support women in relation to domestic abuse, because that will be one of the factors that will reduce women going to prison. And the thing about women go to prison on short sentences, more often than not. Over 80% are on sentences that are very short, less than 6 months. So they're short enough to lose the home, to lose everything, but they're not long enough to address some of the issues for the women. And that's not me advocating for longer sentences by any means. What I'm advocating for is the fact that more women should not go to custody in the first place, and the support should be available in the community, and we should structurally and centrally be funding that support to prevent these cycles from occurring, because children become obviously the invisible victims in this. And there are things that, once a mother has lost her home, and she's lost her child's home, that does something to a woman, and that alters her psyche, it alters her perception of herself as a mother, and that then can have an impact on her ability to move forward positively and make positive relationships and survive, actually. And we know that one thing that I know mothers tell me about all the time that I don't know is often thought about, that when they're evicted, and many women are evicted because most landlords will evict when people go to prison, their property is destroyed. Now you imagine as a mother losing every memento of your children's childhood, you know, belly button things, you know, we keep these wrist tags, photographs, everything goes. That does something to mothers, and sometimes that can be again traced directly back to domestic abuse and homelessness. And when you've got a mum who leaves prison, if she's lost her children, which is ultimately the price that many women pay, then when she comes out of prison, because she doesn't have her children, she's not necessarily a priority to be housed. So because she hasn't got a house, she can't get her children back. So you end up with mothers who have this tautological situation of, I don't have a home, I don't have my children, and they're trapped in this situation that then is perpetuated with all of the other complexities that women leaving prison are then faced with, and they then can end up trapped in this cycle of going back to prison. And I think in COVID, I would have loved to have seen far fewer women go to prison than normal. Sadly, we didn't. There were fewer, but not as few as we would like. And what absolutely did not happen was hundreds of women were identified as being suitable for early release under the COVID scheme, literally hundreds, because obviously most women are in prison for non-violent, low-risk offences, and very few of them were approved for release. Less than 40 women were released under the COVID scheme out of the hundreds that were eligible, and the obstacle was housing. We were told that it was because there was no suitable housing available, and it's how we define that. You know, we did have housing available, but not everybody had a deposit. So what's the issue there? We could have done so much more in terms of making housing available and ensuring housing was available. But also, I know, I'm very aware personally and professionally of private landlords who contacted the Ministry of Justice and said, we've got housing, we'll waive deposits, we will take people, and they weren't even responded to, which is really upsetting when you think about that meant that women separated from their children, not even being able to have visits for 4 or 5 months, could have come home, and yet because of these failures and the lack of funding in the housing area, they they couldn't come out of prison. And I think it's such an under-resourced area. There used to be, in Birmingham, there was a project called the Reunite Project, and they were very aware of this situation where women were leaving prison and then couldn't have their children because they didn't have a house. And they worked properly with women from prison all the way through prison to try and have something in place for when mothers came out, or worked with them and worked with housing agencies. No funding, pulled. It was a wonderful scheme. It kept families together. It changed the lives for the mothers and the children, let's remember, and the children. And the funding was pulled, wasn't important enough, wasn't significant enough. And I think, you know, this is where we come back to some of the structural inequalities, where women always are the poor relation. And housing, I think, is the poor relation of the poor relation sometimes. Am I 5 minutes?
Lucy.
Sorry, I'm ranting now.
No, I want to rant. I'm trying to stop myself. I think between us, we could power the national grid with our righteous anger, don't you? I'm just thinking back to in court, the days that we would think used to put people on a probation order solely. So, you know, 20 years ago, solely so they could get housing advice and get somewhere to live. Do you remember those days?
Absolutely.
They've gone. Blimey. Right, Amanda, it's your turn. So if you can unmute. Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. My background is in lived experience. So I haven't worked in relation service or organisations that help women, but from my own experience, I first struggled with domestic violence at the age of 17. Thankfully, I understood it and moved away. Back then, it didn't even have a name. Financial abuse and coercive behaviour, that wasn't a thing then. So I didn't know that that was an abusive relationship until afterwards. At the time, it was a bad relationship. But looking back, it was abusive, it was toxic. And I lurched from one toxic relationship to the next toxic relationship. And I've struggled with domestic abuse all my life. Fortunately, I don't now. I'm in a good relationship, but domestic abuse, it destroys you in a way that is really hard to explain. It destroys how you think about yourself, how you view other people and the world, and the secrets you feel that you need to keep. Been in some really traumatic, violent relationships, and those around me knew what was happening, but I wouldn't talk about it. A lot of that was to do with shame. A lot of it was to do with, well, I've made my bed, I'll lie in it. And because I wasn't getting help or support from anybody around me, it felt like I was totally on my own. And I fled domestic abuse and became homeless. And homelessness for a woman is totally different to what it is for a man. And we really do need to understand the differences. When I was homeless, I wasn't a statistic, I wasn't a fact, I wasn't a figure, I was sofa surfing. And a lot of people say, well, you've still got a roof over your head, but it's not your home. I had to pay for that bed or that floor with either drugs, money, sex. I paid for the drugs and money by selling sex on the street. This is a fact, and this is what thousands of women are facing today. And we need to look at that. We need to cut that cycle. I went into prison. I came out for a matter of weeks. I came out, I didn't have housing, I didn't have support. I was back working the streets that night, so I had somewhere to sleep, so I could pay for that bed. And I think it's really difficult to explain to men mainly that it is different. It's hard, you know, when if you ask a homeless man, you know, what they have to watch out for if they're street homeless, they'll say, you know, assault, they might be beaten up, they may be spat at, they may be peed on. But you ask that same question to a woman, he has to think about rape and sexual assault as well. That, you know, and coercion and exploitation, that on the streets or sofa surfing, and you're having to pay somebody for that bed, that becomes an exploitation in itself. You are then supporting somebody else's habit. And I knew that if I didn't provide that, I'd be literally sleeping rough on the streets. Now, I have done that in the past. I've slept in a garage, I've slept stairwells and derelict houses. It is terrifying. As a woman, it is terrifying to sit in a doorway and try and sleep. So myself and other women, we used to just walk around, so we didn't have to sleep on a night and be that vulnerable. And it's that vulnerability we need to look at as well. Coming out of prison to no housing, no support, no drug treatment, no nothing, is soul destroying, because you come out with no hope. And then when you get trapped in that cycle of short sentences, been released, committing crime, back to prison, come out to no, it becomes a vicious circle, and then acceptance happens. And I never ever want women to feel acceptance, acceptance that it's all right to stay in that abusive relationship, because you're risking becoming homeless, you're risking losing custody of your children, you're risking so much. And women are just not getting proper support. We wasn't back then, and we're certainly not now. And I know with all the budgets have been cut over the years, which has happened, not just this government, it's been going on for successive governments, and the budget cuts, and it's left to tiny little charities to pick up the pieces. If we stopped putting women in prison for petty crimes, for non-violent crimes, prisons wouldn't be full of women, and full of women that shouldn't be there. When I was in prison, the majority of women in there were in for tiny little sentences. Why can't we do this in the community? And it should be, when I was on probation, when I turned up at the probation office, I was the only female there. When I was doing community service, I was the only female there. We need to have safe spaces where women can go and educate themselves, grow and become stronger through help and support. We talk about trauma a lot, and that trauma is soul destroying and needs to be looked at. Organisations need to be more trauma informed. Until you understand this trauma and the impacts of it, then a woman can't grow. And even just the basics of coping with stress, if you're not taught that, and all your life you pushed your emotions and your stress with alcohol or drugs, it's your first go-to point. So you always go back on that whenever you feel stressed. So then another cycle happens. And all my life, it's been these continuous cycles of drug addiction, prison, drug addiction, working the streets, street prostitution, coercion, homelessness, and it just becomes a vicious cycle. And we need to end them cycles. We need to say, what can we do to help? Proper basic support, not just signposting. Anybody's capable of that. We need active support, and it's not just one thing that needs to be dealt with. I was struggling from multiple disadvantages. Getting me a house, getting me a home, that's perfect, all well and good. But then what? If I'm not given the support, slide into drug addiction again, and then I'm homeless again, and then I'm sofa surfing again, and then I'm committing crime and back in prison. So we need to stop these cycles and these circles. Sorry, I just ranted like mad there, didn't I?
No, that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Amanda. And I think it just showed, one of the wonderful things about the centre is that, lived experience is an incredibly important part of the work. We need academic research, but we also need to hear the reality of things. Elisa, you've been working with, within the probation service for 20 years, undoubtedly seen changes in the services you can offer, and the services that other that women can receive once they're in the system. Over to you.
Thank you. And yes, that's right. I have been in probation for 20 years. And I think really what I would have expected to see in 20 years are far more improvements for women than we have seen. And the reality is that actually things have got worse. Women still go to prison, as Amanda has just said, for things that they really could be served in the community. And the issue of homelessness, which is the biggest issue for us, because nothing else can happen, no rehabilitative work can happen unless there is somewhere safe to lay your head down at the end of the night. It's as simple as that. Getting better from anything, whether it's drug misuse, alcohol misuse, whether it's addressing your trauma, none of that's going to happen unless you've got somewhere safe to shut the door at the end of the night. Simple as that. So it is the biggest issue in my day-to-day job. I think what's become completely obvious from everything that's been said by the other panelists is that women's homelessness cannot be looked at without looking at experiences of trauma. And I think I can say that without exception in my day-to-day work. Every single woman that I work with facing homelessness has had a significant experience of trauma, primarily domestic abuse, and then in its many forms, financial abuse has already been said, but also experiences of childhood sexual abuse, of sexual assault as adult women, through prostitution. There is always trauma at the heart of it, and that leads us to understand that we have got to look at it differently. Therefore, because they are different to what men's experiences are. So having a gendered approach is crucial to the problems within housing and homelessness, but also the problems within the criminal justice system, which are stubbornly persistent. Even though we know so much, the ability to change really is painfully slow. I think the other thing I wanted to mention that hasn't been said is that we have seen a definite increase in the past 10 years, with regards to austerity, that women are at a greater economic disadvantage now as well. And I think you have to look at that in the context of a really sometimes quite punitive and certainly more complicated welfare system. If we think about the issues with universal credit, which has really been a difficult area as well. And if you put that next to the lack of social housing and extremely high rents, and very often landlords who don't want to accept women with a criminal record, or indeed people on benefit. So it's a really complex situation. I was going to say multiple disadvantage, but that's the truth. It is complicated. And the women that I work with are an even greater disadvantage because of the fact that they are involved in yet another system that hasn't quite got to grips with the importance of a gendered approach. So again, it becomes even more complicated for them, because where a woman might be already in a precarious situation as a result of domestic abuse and precarious housing, chuck a 3-week prison sentence into that, and then you'll see some real disruption, and the result of that is that we are always in a crisis management mode. And actually what we want to do is be planning and looking to the future, because there is so much to be gained from tackling this issue properly. When you think about the children that are involved, when you are stopping further victims, aren't you? You are stopping homelessness in future generations. There is so much to be gained from doing this properly. So I want to talk very briefly about the response during COVID, because I guess the thing that I found most interesting about that is that it's interesting, isn't it? Because if the political will is there, things can happen. And it is about political will, isn't it? Because actually all of a sudden there was money to tackle homelessness. And that's not to say that how it was tackled was successful, because in my experience and from my service users, it hasn't been that successful for a whole host of reasons. And actually, I think the main reason there is because they didn't look at it again from a gender-informed approach, and to understand that women were going to need a different service, and to let people out into hotels that were perhaps already full of men violent men or people that are drinking, or, you know, people with similar problems. That wasn't going to work, but the money was there. So the political will is important. We need to understand that, don't we? And I think, but it shows that it can happen, and that's what we need to push for, isn't it? We need to say, actually, you have done this, but now you need to look at it differently, and to look at a sustainable model, and you do that by involving, you know, people that can inform a gendered approach. It's as simple as that, really. I'm not suggesting that solving it is simple, but, you know, I think having that different perspective is crucial. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Elisa. Thank you, everybody. I've got a couple of questions for you, and then I'm trying to amalgamate questions and comments from the chat and the Q&A. And I just wanted to ask you about how well do you think agencies as a whole deal with, I don't know, we like women to be grateful. We like women to be a one-dimensional victim. Bad things have happened to this woman, and I will swoop in and I will make things better for her. And instead of the reality, which, you know, the more it is not like that. And I just wondered, what can we do with, you know, whether you're working in homelessness, housing, probation, social care, whatever, how can we get across the fact that, you know, if you've been battered, if you've been raped, if you've been homeless, if you've been, you know, doing sex work, if you've been, you know, all this, that leaves a massive load of scars, and you're not going to be particularly trusting or grateful or anything else. Anyone, any ideas on that? Is it all about listening to people with lived experience, Amanda?
All I can say is, the agencies I worked with, I often got accused of not engaging, that I was hard to reach, that I was difficult, that I didn't show emotion. But if you understood my trauma, you'd understand why I wasn't engaging, why I wasn't showing my emotions. It wasn't that I was emotionless, but I had to go through my story that many times. It almost becomes bullet points, and it's given with no emotion, because I don't want to upset myself and then be left with it all, because as soon as I leave that building, I'm left with it all. So if it's done in a more trauma-informed way, then I'm not left with all that. I'm not accused of not engaging or you know, being hard to reach. I wasn't engaging because I'd engaged 20 some times before. I was hard to reach because I'd done all that. I'd been on so many methadone courses, failed, back to homelessness, back to street prostitute, you know, that continual cycle I was talking about. You get stuck in that. It's okay, you know, somebody said, we'll do on a methadone course, we'll get you a home, but if it doesn't happen, not everything dealt with it, you know, at the same time, then you're still homeless with mental health problems, addiction problems. So, you know, being more trauma informed is vital in agencies and services. You know, we do need to look at it. Women are different, and we cannot deny that. We cannot deny that. Thanks.
Can I, Lucy?
I think the other thing as well, I mean, absolutely, Amanda, I totally agree with you. And having grown up in domestic abuse and experienced domestic abuse myself, I completely agree with every word you've said. But I think the other thing as well that's important for professionals is the working together and the work in partnerships. And I think so many agencies work in silos, and I think that, particularly after probation separated from social work, you know, I think my generation, when I qualified as a social worker and probation officer, welfare was a huge part of it, and we looked at everything holistically. And then when probation separated, probation became about enforcement and social services with the welfare. And I think there was a separation of mindset in terms of, well, you do that and I'll do this. And really there needs to be more significant partnerships. And I think when I was a practitioner, because I'd been in both, else, I always made sure that if we had CPA meetings or MAPA meetings or any of those meetings, that everybody was invited, and essentially that housing were there, but most particularly because I think sometimes the housing person, and this is one of the reasons why I loved Kelly's chapter in the new book, because it really reminded me of how passionately I used to desperately want housing to be included in these meetings, because often they were the people who knew the person best, and they were the person who the women would trust the most, because they weren't the one trying to take the kids, they weren't the one checking you were being a good mum, they weren't the one checking you were complying with your order. Do you know what I mean? They were there for the women, and so they often had really significant insights. And so for me, I think that partnership working is really, really important, but including the women in that partnership working and being clear about, we're all going to speak to each other. If that's okay with you, you can be part of it, you can see anything, but we're doing it for you, all of us. And I think that is really important.
Brilliant. Can I just come to you, Kelly, on maybe on that, but also we have seen a change in the last few months around priority need. One of the questions that's come in, and that was an ask from absolutely everybody involved. So maybe a victory, I don't know, it depends how it happens. Are you optimistic that this will make a change?
I am optimistic, and I think one of the positive, not that there's anything positive in COVID, by the way, God, that's a headline, isn't it, that you don't want. I think one of the things that we've come to realise in COVID is that, how essential housing is, and I think how essential the relationship, as Lucy said, that as a housing officer that you have with customers, and we could be that conduit to those specialist services. And I just know from one of the customers who's one of our Daha ambassadors now, she's 77, and she took part in my research, and it was that contact with the housing officer. She'd lived with domestic abuse for over 40 years. She was 77, and it was just going out doing a customer visit. And this person never had any reason, the housing officer never had any reason to contact them. The rent was always paid, the garden was always spotless, there was never any noise nuisance complaints. It was kind of, a great tenancy. But, you go out and you do, your annual visit. And it was when she was having the discussion with this woman, our ambassador, that she realised that actually what she had been experiencing was domestic abuse, handed over tenant handbook, etc., and said, we can provide support for this, this and this. We do lunch clubs, we do this, blah, blah, blah. And it was actually the next morning, she walked down to the housing office at 8:30 and said, I think I might be experiencing domestic abuse. And I think, she said she would never have rang the police. She would never have gone to a specialist charity because she wasn't really sure. And I think what Amanda said earlier, kind of, sometimes you're not really sure it is abuse, and you might think that this is just kind of life. This is how it is for everybody. So she got support, and I'm really pleased to say she now lives in a fabulous bungalow, is involved in the community and has a total new lease of life. It's 78. So I think just that one contact with the housing officer and having somebody that is listening to you and that you can trust. And is it's just there to go, how's your tenancy, how's everything going? And it was that relationship and that connection. And again, what Amanda and Lucy and Eliza have all said, kind of, it's about having that understanding, and it's not a case of just telling your story time and time again to people who become immune to it. It was a real connection, and she's now in a positive place. But I just think that's why, as housing providers, we really need to be upskilled in recognising and responding to domestic abuse through repairs, through rent arrears. So if you're looking at everything together, if you're doing a rent arrears visit and you think, right, I'm here about the rent. Well, actually, what we would say at Daha is think domestic abuse on every contact with every customer. We're not saying that in every case it's going to be domestic abuse, but just have your mind open to think this could be domestic abuse. This rent arrears could actually be economic abuse. Looking at repairs in the property, there's been 3 bathroom door locks on this property in the last year, requests for repairs. Building up a picture and saying, well, what is this telling us about this? And then knowing, as a housing officer, I know, you just get, you know, I used to, when I was a housing officer, you just get so involved in the lives of your customers, and knowing that you could be that one link to that person. And I think as housing providers, we need to realise that we need to upskill ourselves. And obviously, as you know, I believe that we need to be regulated so that, you know, we can't just pick and choose if we do it or not. And know that what a difference we can make in the community. And I would also add as well, I think what I found in my research was quite a lot of housing professionals that I interviewed said that they were only invited to, you know, round table discussions, different partnership meetings, when actually it was at the point of crisis and accommodation was needed. But where were those invites early on? And as you said, you know, we are often the people who know most about our customers. So where was that invite early on? So I think there's I think all across sectors we need to realise what housing can bring to the table, really. Sorry, I was going off on a ranty tangent.
Thanks, Kelly. Quite a few questions around being trauma informed. Elisa, have you come across any really good practice? Where do you access what you need to do your job? And what would you recommend?
I mean, I think there are pockets of good practice, and I think part of that comes with what you were talking about before, the tendency for some people to shy away from working with women, you know, that concept of the perfect victim and all of that. And, you know, one of the things I've heard said so many times over the years, I don't like working with women because they're difficult. And then, you know, we have to remind ourselves, you know, when we hit that really powerful lived experience of Amanda, for instance, but wouldn't you be bloody difficult if you'd been through that? And I think, you know, actually you can do training. Obviously, you know, there's lots of good training for people out there around trauma, but honestly, for me, sometimes it's just about checking yourself and just thinking about what might that have been like for you if you had been through that. You probably would be difficult to engage. I would be bloody angry. You know, I'm angry at the best of times, and I haven't been through half the stuff that Amanda has explained there. So, and when you check yourself like that, I think that's what encourages you to try again. You know, with women, you're not just going to try once and get the perfect solution. You try again, you try something differently, and then you try again, you know, and it's just having a bit of persistence, I think. So yes, there is obviously lots of good training out there, and I'm sure lots of people can make those recommendations, but also just the general understanding around what women are going through, and that they are disadvantaged in almost every avenue, and just checking, you know, reminding yourself that that's really important. Again, Alison, it's about looking at all things through a gendered perspective. I know I've said it so many times, but that it really is crucial in everything we do, because nothing is designed for women.
One of the things I've reflected on in the last couple of years is that, you know, I first got involved with Women's Aid in probably 1986, which is frightening, nearly 35 years ago. And the journey for women experiencing abuse in those days was into a refuge, probably 4 to 6 months, which was considered at the time you needed to heal, and then almost invariably leave refuge, go into a lifetime secured tenancy in a council house. How much of all of this do you think, whether it's you know, I think a lot of domestic abuse occurs because people live with people they shouldn't be living with, but no one's got anywhere else to bloody well live. So you end up shacked up together in one room, and actually that's, you know, not what you would do in an ideal world. We've all seen men who move around from woman to woman to woman, and, you know, repeat abusing. So how much? So we frame this quite rightly in terms of the services we need specifically for women. Are we taking our eye off the ball in terms of we just need more housing? You know, has that got to be an integral part of everything? Oh, I've got Elisa, then Kelly.
Well, maybe not just housing, but definitely social housing.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. There just isn't enough where, you know, whatever local authority you go to, there isn't housing. I mean, I'm speaking primarily from my experience in Essex. That's my main experience, but without a doubt.
Right, I'm going to go to Kelly and Lucy, and then I want the last word to go to Amanda before we finish. But just to say, there's been some quite interesting stuff coming up on the chat, and a project I was tangentially involved with Big Society Capital, looking at providing safe accommodation for women and their children, primarily leaving violent relationships, that is almost it's funded alongside, you know, it's not part of the social housing system, it's a sort of separate stream of accommodation that can be managed and run by charities. I'd just recommend that everybody takes a look at that work, just to see if there's some options that that we could look to use. Kelly.
Yeah, I was just going to add really that I totally agree. Yes, we do need more social housing, undoubtedly, but I think it needs to be part of a coordinated community response to domestic abuse. So housing isn't the only answer. And I think, you know, it's about everybody in society, all sectors playing their part in responding to domestic abuse and dealing with the cause of the problem, perpetrators of domestic abuse. So why should women have to be constantly made homeless and, you know, leaving a much loved home, etc., when actually we need to focus on the cause of the problem, the perpetrator. What can we do about the perpetrator? And I think I'm really hopeful, I think, that, you know, the launch of the perpetrator strategy, I think maybe will shift focus on dealing with the cause of the problem, and that women can stay in their homes when they wish to do so. I think that's essential. But obviously more social housing is just one element of that.
Brilliant, Kelly. Lucy, could you also have a think about something that has been missing from our discussion so far, and you know, apologies for not raising it earlier, was the number of women with no recourse to public funds. So another layer of, you know, absolute desperation.
I was going to talk about, and I think we actually need, I mean, part of that is I think we need a real overhaul of the benefit system and how we are forcing women into poverty, which forces them into homelessness because of the sanctions, because of the bedroom tax, because of, you know, and the bedroom tax, how that even got in through the back door, it beggars belief. But I've got a woman who went to prison because she couldn't pay a bedroom tax. It's, you know, we are the only country in the Western world, England, Scotland and Wales don't do it, but England is the only country that still imprisons people for debt. It's not a criminal offence, it's a civil offence, but we still send people to prison for it. And I think, you know, we have to structurally, really structurally and centrally look at how disproportionately the lack of recourse to public funding and the benefit system disproportionately affects women and disproportionately pushes them into situations like homelessness and offending that triggers the cycles that Amanda talked about earlier. We have to do better.
Yeah, there's an absolutely incredible charity in East London, based in Newham, called the Magpie Project. I don't know if people have come across it. If you haven't, look it up. But supporting young mums in particular who have got no recourse to public funds, and some of the stories coming out of there. It's everything that we've talked about, overlaid with a very deep layer of, you know, racism in a lot of cases. A system that just leaves migrant women basically to rot. And there's been, you know, phenomenal amount of work in the domestic, you know, trying to get amendments to the domestic abuse bill that have not succeeded. So what I'm thinking about now, we've talked about how the systems that surround women who are homeless need to be gendered. We need to overlay that with race, with racism. What are the, you know, what does that mean, and where? Because, you know, invariably women are suffering as a result of these issues, but Black women, women from minority communities are suffering even more. And you know, we need to make sure that we deal with that. We have got 6 minutes left. Let me look. what steps can we take outside of and alongside pushing for legislative change? This is a really interesting one for me, because it's not, you know, you don't just get random bits of legislation appear, do you? That come out of social movements, out of listening to people, out of other pressures. I'm going to ask you all, what would your priority be? How do we push for change? What's the most effective thing? You're all looking at me like, don't go to me first. Elisa.
Really is, isn't it? Because we've got to go grassroots up, but we also have to come top down. And I think some of these changes have to be thought about centrally, structurally. We need, you know, and I think via, you know, ministers who are specifically and only focused on women and women's needs. And I think, you know, they have to be much more strategic and structural in how they prove their worth as women's ministers. Do you know what I mean? It's, you know, demonstrate what are you actually going to do that's going to make a difference to women, and every strand of women's lives needs to be not monitored and surveilled, but there needs to be some redressing of some balance and some equality in terms of services. But that, you know, treating people the same doesn't necessarily always mean treating people fairly, you know. And I think it goes back to what we've said from the very beginning, that it's recognising that most things are different for women. Most services and structures and how they impact women are different for women, and that needs to be addressed and recognised centrally and funded centrally.
Brilliant.
Shall I go next?
Yeah, go on.
So, I mean, I think we've known a lot of that stuff, haven't we, for a very long time. And certainly when we look at the criminal justice system, we've known this for a very long time, but nothing changes. So, you know, something different has to happen. And if I had a one wish that could, you know, make a change, and I could make it happen with a magic wand, I would have feminists that understand that things need to be done differently in all positions of power and decision making. So basically, you know, sisters need to take over because it won't change otherwise. We've seen that. We continue to battle the same battles. So actually we need to have women in positions as, you know, as ministers, but also as head of organisation, encouraging other women to speak and share their lived experiences. It isn't going to be given to us.
But they have to be informed women. I mean, we've got pretty
Of course.
do you know what I mean? We're not going to get the changes that we need for women.
They're feminists.
And I think what we've got to do as well, I mean, particularly in terms of the judiciary, and Alison, this will probably resonate with you, is, you know, we really hoped at the Farmer Review, which was a review that looked into how the criminal justice system works for women, we really hoped that they would tackle some of the inconsistencies in the judiciary in terms of magistrates sending women to prison for stupid things. And it was something I raised in my oral and written evidence to the Parliamentary Committee, and was told, no, we have to protect the autonomy of the judiciary, and they want the discretion to make the decisions. But there's so little accountability when, you know, I worked with a woman who was sentenced on her due date with a toddler at home, and she shoplifted £5 worth of shampoo, and she was sent to prison as a pregnant mum. And yet, and I can feel
I desperately want Amanda to, you know, have the last contribution, if you would like, Amanda. What do people need to know?
They need to know that done right, I can only tell of my own experience. When all this trauma I experienced, all the problems I was experiencing, I went into a hostel 17 years ago, and it had a woman's wing with a locked door. And you were saying earlier on, the first place to start is a safe space to sleep. A safe space for you personally. I had my own door, I had a secondary door. That was the beginning of me changing my life. One member of staff called Pam, she was my key worker. If it wasn't for her, I'd be dead or in prison. You know, I'd be still going. But just her reaching out and saying, what can I do to help? That meant so much. Instead of being told we're going to do this, 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 and this, and you're thinking, I've tried this, 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 and this. We tried it a different way, and that help led on to me searching for other help and support, which helped me ultimately change my life. And if it wasn't for these key workers who work so hard, I wouldn't be here today. And I know that people really do want to make a difference, and they want systems to change. And I think that starts with people wanting that change, organisations wanting to look at it differently, but it must include those with lived experience, because it's all right, you know, the board of trustees making decisions, or, you know, the board members making these decisions. If they haven't got a clue to the reality of it, then they're going to be wrong decisions. So we need to look at the systems within our systems. And it starts from the very basics. And people with lived experience have got so much to offer. We have so much experience and knowledge to give. And we're willing to do that, often for free, voluntarily, because we want to make a difference. We can see the failings, but we can also see what worked for us. And I think that's the important thing, that we all need to work together to find a solution, not just the board of trustees or the people on the front line, but we need to join together and find better solutions for vulnerable women. Because after all, you know, we're talking about women's lives. Women are dying because, well, women are dying.
Okay, we've reached 12 o'clock, and I think that's the perfect place to stop, Amanda. And if that's not an incentive for all of us to sort of redouble our efforts, then I don't know what is. Some fantastic insights, really powerful messages to end the session with. Thank you to everyone. First of all, thank you to our wonderful panelists. If you're sitting in your living room at home, can you give them a clap? I'm going to give them a clap, so can you do the same? That was a pathetic clap, wasn't it? I really wish I hadn't done that. But thank you to everyone who's come along and shared their thoughts in the chat. And remember, keep the conversation going using the hashtag CHIFest2020. It really slips off the tongue. Thank you to the Centre for Homelessness Impact for giving us the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today. And everybody have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Nice to see everyone.
We're going to wave now.
No, bye.